Good day, everyone. Magandang araw po sa ating lahat. Again, welcome to Malayan Colleges Laguna and also welcome to SS031. Again, this is SS031, Understanding the Self. And today we will be starting off with our first lecture. Now, again, doon po sa ating ginawang course orientation, I hope that you've already had an idea and a glimpse of what we are supposed to discuss in this course. And ito po ngayon ang ating umpisahan is part of our first module, and today our discussion will be focusing on the philosophical journey to discovering the self. Again, welcome to our first lecture. Again, this is SS31, Understanding the Self. And again, today our discussion will be concentrating on a philosophical journey of discovering the self. Dada Baga. Bhagwan once said, "Who am I? Not knowing this is the greatest death to the soul or to one's own self." Why is it that this person was saying that not being able to answer the question, "Who am I?" is like a death or the greatest death to the soul? Now we know that when we talk about philosophy, at least if you have studied this back in your senior high school, we realize that the subject of philosophy deals with the ultimate questions of life. And part of that question that philosophy deals to and strives to answer is the question of who am I? And in our journey for today's discussion, we will try to answer the question, who am I, from a philosophical perspective. Again, welcome to our first lecture in this course. This is a philosophical journey to discovering the self. And today will be our lecture outcome. So, part of our outcomes that we want to reach is number one, we hope to understand the importance of knowing the self. Also, we will try to recognize the different perspectives regarding the nature of man. Also, we will try to assess the philosophical perspective of the self by critiquing the arguments of different philosophers, okay, as to how they understand the self to be. And lastly, we will try to develop our own answer to the question, who am I? Now, philosophy has always sought to answer life's difficult questions, and it has relentlessly pursued answers to these, no matter how seemingly futile the quest might be. Because when you talk about the question, who am I, for a lot of people, they would say that this is a very simple question to answer. But then again, in philosophy, you have to dig deeper into the concept of the self for you to understand who you really are. Now, when we talk about the concept of who we are, so these are just some of the questions that we want to give an answer of. The first one is this: just what exactly are we? Are we creations of the mind? Are we just phantoms? Or are we creations of an omnipotent being? Also, we have the question, what do we even mean by the self? Are we souls, organic bodies, or merely a figment of another's imagination? Say, if I see someone in front of me and I ask that person, are you really who I see right now? Perhaps that person might just laugh at that question. But then again, there is a possibility perhaps that the person that we are seeing in front of us is not really that person in its entirety. Perhaps that person is just what? Is just what? Okay? That person is just what? An incomplete idea or an imperfect fraction, okay, of the real person. And also, we try to understand of the self by answering the question, are we just minds or a combination of body and mind? The next question is this: will we survive bodily death? Because we are more than a body. Or ano bang mangyayari sa katawan natin kapag tayo ay namatay na? Is that really the end of the self, or are we actually robots controlled by some entity somewhere out there? Now, this unit will discuss selected philosophers' answer to the question, who am I? Now, that question may be one of the most difficult to answer and has garnered attention right from the start of man's self reflection. But no matter how difficult it is, we cannot just ignore the question and leave it unanswered. That's the reason why we try to answer the question, who am I, at least from the philosophical perspective at this time. What we do and our reaction to the world has a lot to do with how we see ourselves. In an age when the pursuit of one's happiness and celebrating one's identity seems to be at the forefront, now, the question, who am I, still has no easy answer. And so, as we try to answer the question, who am I, at least from the philosophical perspective, now we look at this from this perspective. Okay, we look at the self here on your screen, and we talk about the self as what? The philosophical quest is aimed at what? Unraveling, trying to understand who man is and his nature by looking not only on the everyday goals of man, what do we intend to accomplish daily, but to determine what ultimately man is, the ultimate reason why man exists, his goals, his essence. And that is what we are trying to understand when we try to understand man from the philosophical perspective. And so, in philosophy, what do we mean by the self? Now, the self is composed of self perception as defined by what? Their self concept, their self esteem, their self knowledge, and their social self. So, if you're going to look at your screen right now, you will see here the different ideas of how philosophy actually understands the self. So, when you talk about the self from the philosophical perspective, this includes our self concept, our self esteem, our self knowledge, and our social self. And these are what we are going to study as we try to navigate and understand what we are and who we really are. Now, some of the great minds from our history approach the question, who am I? So, you in your screen right now, you will see the philosophical great giants of the time. So, you have the likes of Socrates, of Plato, and of St. Augustine. And also, you have the likes of Rene Descartes, John Locke, David Hume. Also, we will try to understand the self from the perspective of Immanuel Kant, of Sigmund Freud, of Gilbert Ryle, of Paul Churchland, and of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Now, I don't want for you to have a difficult time to understand their philosophies, and so as much as possible, I would try my best to help you understand the self from the philosophical perspective ng mas madali. And so we are now going to proceed with the first concept of the self from the philosophical perspective, at least according to Socrates. A little bit of a trivia about Socrates. Now, Socrates never really wrote a book, and most of the things that we know about him came from Xenophon and his prized student Plato. Now, we know of Plato as one of the philosophical giants also of this time, but there would never be a Plato without a Socrates. Okay, so this is also the reason why it is very difficult to somehow differentiate the philosophies and the ideas of Socrates from Plato, because Socrates never really wrote a book. Whatever we know about his philosophies were because of what? Because of the writings of Xenophon and Plato. Now, he was born in Athens and he was married with several children, and he's also known as a market philosopher because of his penchant for engaging the youth in philosophizing in public markets. Uh, one of the most famous um, adages coming from Socrates is this when he said, an unexamined life is not worth living. Let me repeat that. He said, an unexamined life is not worth living. And so you see here that he tried to answer the question of life by examining life itself. And at a time when people were looking at science and trying to understand the world out there during his time, he tried to direct his philosophy and its attention from the universe to an examination of our existence in the universe. Now, what are the ideas of Socrates, at least, about the self? According to him, there is soul first before man's body, which means man first existed in the realm of ideas. Now, wherever that realm of ideas here is, Socrates did not really give a concrete answer, but at least for him, before man was born, there was already man, meaning there was already the soul itself before even it became a body. Man first existed in the realm of ideas and exists as a soul or a pure mind. Now, for him, there was soul first before man's body. Now, this soul, according to him, has already knowledge by direct intuition, and all these are stored in his mind. However, once he came into the material world, or the world of senses, or say the world that we are living in right now, he forgot the ideas that he knew. Thus, he became ignorant. And the reason why we are not able to understand who we are right now is because of our ignorance. And that ignorance was the result of us being born into the material world. Why? Because at least according to Socrates, we knew everything in the realm of ideas when we first existed as souls or a pure mind. However, we became ignorant when we were born into this world. This resulted in lack of our knowledge or ignorance. And however, for Socrates, there is a solution to this ignorance because for him, knowledge can be restored through the process of dialectic method, or what we call as the Socratic method. What is this Socratic method, by the way? Now, when we talk about the Socratic method, this is an exchange of question and answer that ultimately aims to make the person remember all the knowledge that he has forgotten, including his former omniscient self. Now, when we talk about the character of being omniscient, that means you know everything. Meaning, at least according to Socrates, man, before he was born, when he was first a soul or a pure mind existing in the realm of ideas, he was an omniscient being, meaning he knew everything, but he lost all his knowledge when he was born into this world. And so the way that he will be able to gain or to regain that knowledge back, to regain that omniscient self, is by asking and asking and asking and asking and asking questions. Now, this is an exchange of question and answer that ultimately aims to make, again, the person remember all the knowledge that he has forgotten, including his former omniscient self. Again, just to summarize what Socrates believes about the self, he believed that the self existed even before we were born into in the material world. And that self is an omniscient self, an all knowing self existing in the realm of ideas as a soul or a pure mind. Now, a while ago, we talked about Socrates having a student by the name of Plato, and now we will be proceeding with Plato and his view of the self. Now, Plato was born into an aristocratic Athenian family. He was involved in the rule of the 30 tyrants, and he also later in life founded the academy, now considered as the prototype of modern university. According to Plato, if we are ever to have pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body and contemplate things by themselves with the soul itself. Now, an important part of the philosophy of Plato is the dichotomy or yung magka, pagkakahiwalay or pagkakaiba ng ideal world or the world of forms and the material world. Okay, so para lang po hindi tayo masyadong malito, ang ilan sa mga philosophies ni Plato ay katulad ng philosophies ni Socrates. However, there are certain statements, ideas, okay, na magkaiba po sila. Now, at least according to Plato, if we want to have a pure knowledge of everything, then we have to get rid of the body. Why is he saying that we have to get rid of the body? Okay? Kasi masama daw po ang katawan ng tao. Let's proceed with these ideas about the self. Okay. Now, when we talk about the idea of Plato about the self, according to him, human beings are composed of two things. Human beings are composed of two things. Okay. The body and the soul. For him, the soul is the true self. When we say that the soul is the true self, meaning it is the permanent unchanging self found in the world of ideas. Now, doon kay Plato, ang sabi niya, it's in the realm of ideas. Okay? Ang sabi niya rito, saan daw matatagpuan yung totoong sarili natin? Ito ay matatagpuan sa realm of ideas. But for Plato, the true self can be found where? It can be found in the world of ideas. Okay? Now, for him, the body is what we see in the material world. But the body that we have here in the material world is just a replica of the true self. That is the reason why it is changing. Kaya po sinasabi niyang replika yung ating katawan dito dahil ang katawan ng tao, yung ating material self na tinatawag, ay nagbabago. Now, for him, the soul was already existing even before bodily death, and thus will survive even after the body dies. So makikita natin dito that at least according to Plato, the self will continue to exist even after we die. Thus, for him, the body becomes a prison to the soul. Now, for him, in order for us to release ourselves from this prison, we have to contemplate. And contemplation is all about the union of the mind with universal and eternal ideas. Now, for Plato, the world of forms is the permanent, unchanging reality, as opposed to the world of materials, which keeps on changing. The material world, at least according to Plato, is where we live. But this is just, again, a replica of the world found in the world of forms. Now, this differentiation is reflected in his idea of the nature of man. He believed that human beings are composed again of what? Of body and of soul. The changing body. Ito pong katawan natin, or what we see in the material world, is not the real self. Okay, so for him, the real self cannot be found in the material world because the true self is in the world of ideas. Now, the body is seen as some sort of a prison, like what I said a while ago. And so, according to Plato, we continue to exist even in the absence of our bodies because, again, we are souls only. And that is what it is, at least according to Plato. Let us now continue with our discussion. And now here, we will be proceeding with the concept of the self, at least according to Saint Augustine. Now, Saint Augustine is one of the most popular Christian philosophers, not only during his time, but even up to this point. Now, Saint Augustine was born from a Christian family. However, he abandoned his early Christian faith because he found it difficult to reconcile a loving, an all knowing, and an all powerful God with the evils in the world. He was saying that if God is really an all knowing and a loving and an all powerful God, then why is he allowing evil to exist in the world and to plague humanity? And so it was his encounter with the with what we call as the Platonists or the Neoplatonists and the idea of the world of forms, which gave him a philosophical strong point for the idea that God exists and paved the way for his return to Christianity. He also goes on to say that the moral law exists and is imposed on the mind. For him, there is an eternal law which should be universally followed because this is coming from the eternal reason or God himself. Now, this eternal law is the law of conscience. Ito yung sinasabi ni Saint Augustine. Now, there was a time in his journey in understanding himself and life in general when he was quoted as saying, "But my sin was this, that I looked for pleasure, for beauty and truth, not in him, capital HIM, but in myself and in his creatures. And the search led me instead to pain, confusion, and error." This is found in one of his most popular books, The Confessions. Now, what does or what did St. Augustine said about the self? Now, we have to understand that St. Augustine was highly influenced by Plato. We talked about the permanent world. However, he somehow Christianized the philosophies of Plato. Although he was influenced by Plato, we have to understand that Plato did not categorically say that the world of forms or the world of ideas is where God is. But here we see St. Augustine trying to Christianize the idea of the ideas of Plato when he said that the permanent world is where God is and the material world is our world at the moment. And for him, man or the self is created out of God's love and also created in his image or in his imago Dei. When we talk about the imago Dei, we talk about the image of God in man. Now, for him, he also has an man also has an immortal soul whose goal is to be with God eternally. So for him, the idea of the self is to be with his creator eternally. And so the pursuit of happiness, at least according to St. Augustine, can only be achieved in God alone. Now, again, taking his cue from the two worlds of Plato, he differentiated what the real world is and what the temporary world looks like. For him, the real world is the permanent world where God is, and the temporary world is the material world where which we are living in at the moment. And so we will now proceed with the next philosopher, and this is Rene Descartes. I believe that most of you, if not all of you, already knew who Rene Descartes is. Now, a little bit of a trivia about Rene Descartes. We know him as the father of modern philosophy. He was a Frenchman who was also a brilliant mathematician, and we know of the Cartesian geometry for this one. Now, Rene Descartes was hired to tutor Queen Christina of Sweden. However, he died of pneumonia soon after because his health could not take the 5 a.m. start of lesson required by the Queen. Ikaw ba naman ang magturo ng alas 5 ng madaling araw kung hindi ka mamamatay? And so that is just a sort of a trivia about Rene Descartes. Now, we also know Rene Descartes for his famous saying, "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum." Now, this is very much important in our understanding of Rene Descartes' idea of the self. For him, the essence of man is in being. That's the reason why he said, "I think, therefore I am." Okay? Now, since the mind and body are separate, but at the same time conjoined with one another, that they causally act upon each other. That's the reason why, at least according to Rene Descartes, you cannot really move without the body. But for him, the self is mind more than the body. Now, since there is no boxing the mind, we also have different ways of using language and responding to circumstances in unpredictable way, because these two are products of the mind. Now, for him, the essence of the self is in its being a thinking being. The self being the mind more than the body. I think, therefore I am. His very popular say, or his very popular words, emphasizes the consciousness of his mind, which leads to an evidence of his existence, despite the fact that he is doubting the existence of everything physical, including his own body. Again, for him, man's essence lay in being a purely thinking being, because even if he can doubt whether he has real body or it's just a trick of his senses, one thing he cannot doubt is that he is thinking. So when he says, "I think, therefore I am," when man starts thinking, then he stops becoming. Okay? That's the reason why he said, "I think, therefore I am." Okay? So that is what Rene Descartes' philosophy is all about. And so we will now be proceeding with this one, which is John Locke. Now, he's known as the father of classical liberalism because of his contribution to the formation of human rights. He is the first of the great British empiricist philosopher. Now, when you talk about empiricism, what we mean by that is that a person only believes what his senses tells him to. Okay? Kung ano lang yung nasa-sense ng tao, yun lang ang paniniwalaan niya. Okay? So, he does not believe in the concept of whatever is not seen or whatever is not sensed by the self. So, ano nga ba yung mga senses ng tao, di ba? You have the sense of touch, sense of sight, sense of smell, sense of hearing, and so on. So for him, kapag hindi nasa-sense, then that's not part of reality. Okay, that's the reason why he is considered as an empiricist. Now, according to John Locke, what worries you masters you, which is true. Diba? Kapag nag-worry ang isang tao, okay, diba? And you try to think too much about your worries, then para kang napaparalyze na lang doon sa may worrying yon. And you have to understand that most of our worries are not true. Now, for him, the self is not locked in the mind. However, it's only in the body and soul only, because for him, the memory, and this is a key word in John Locke's understanding of the self, the memory is part of the definition of the self, and this is what he was famous for, the memory theory, where he said that we are the same person as we were in the past for as long as we can remember something from that past. That way, our memory renders us self-conscious that we are that one and the same person. Okay? So, ang ibig niyang sabihin dito, kapag naaalala mo yung mga bagay na ginawa mo before, now that's part of who you are. But then, kapag nakalimutan mo, ang ibig sabihin ba nito, hindi na ikaw yon. Say for example, kapag ikaw ay pumasok sa eskwelahan ng late, pagkatapos, you were called out by your teacher, at sinabing, late ka kahapon, and then you don't remember, ma'am, hindi ko na maalala, hindi po ako yon. So that's not who you are anymore, at least according to the perspective of John Locke, because for him, the memory is part of the definition of the self, and whatever you still remember about yourself is part of who you are, at least according to John Locke. Okay? Ang keyword dito sa idea ni John Locke sa self natin, yung memorya natin ng kung sino tayo sa raan. Okay? As long as naaalala natin yon, then that's part of who we are. And so, we will now proceed with David Hume. Okay, ito yung isa sa pinaka-importanting kailangan nating malaman, si David Hume. Now, born in Scotland, he was a lawyer, but is known more for the history book that he wrote, The History of England. Just like Locke, he is an empiricist, okay, and regarded as senses as our key source of knowledge. So whatever cannot be sensed is not true. Now, in 1738, for David Hume, he does believe in the existence of the mind, and what's inside the mind is divided into two. You have the impressions, and then you have the ideas. Okay? Ano po yung ibig sabihin ni David Hume dito? Okay? The mind is divided into two, the impressions and the ideas. How do we define impressions? The impressions, okay, are things directly perceived by the senses. So, kapag kumain ako, halimbawa ng apple, and ang sense ko ay matamis siya, okay? Tama, matamis. So, that's, na-taste ko siya, so that's an impression. However, when you talk about ideas, these are things created in the mind, or it can be a combination of impressions. Say, I saw an apple, it's green, it's kind of round, at least, okay, or it could be red, and it's sweet. So those are ideas because these are already combinations of impressions. According to Hume, when he looks in the mind, there is no impression that corresponds to the self because the self constantly changes. Kaya pag pinag-usapan natin yung self, according to him, the self is merely the perception we have at the moment it is being perceived. Therefore, for him, the enduring self is just a fiction because we cannot observe a permanent self because the concept of the self is ever changing. Thus, for his conclusion, he said that there is no self. The reason is because he argues that when he looks again into the mind, okay, he finds a stream of impressions and ideas. However, the self keeps changing, and that's the reason why he says, okay, that there is no permanent and unchanging self dahil kung sino ka ang self ngayon, magbabago yun bukas or sa susunod na araw. And by that, he believed that there is no self because we all change. Now, how do we then respond when someone tells us, please don't change? When, at least according to David Hume, the self changes every time. Diba? Magandang pag-isipan itong tanong na ito. Now, according to David Hume, reason is and ought only to be the slave of passion and can never pretend to any other office other than to serve and obey them. And now we will be continuing on with another philosopher, Immanuel Kant. Now, according to him, all our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds to understanding, and ends with reason. He gives so much importance to reason. That's why he said that there is nothing higher than reason. Tingnan natin po ito, no? Ang sabi niya, everything begins with our senses. And when we sensed it already, we try to understand what we sensed. And with that understanding, it gives us the reasonability or the rationality of our knowledge. Now, Immanuel Kant was considered as one of the giants in philosophy, and he was spurred into philosophical activism when he encountered yung skepticism ni David Hume, and he took it upon himself to refute it. Okay, nakalabanin ito because for him, he argued that it is possible to discover universal truth about the world using our reason. And for him, he also argued that it is possible to find the essence of the self, something that is going against the concept of David Hume, because at least for David Hume, again, there is no self because what you know about the self at the moment is always changing. That is what Immanuel Kant is actually trying to refute. Okay, ito po yung kinakalaban ni Immanuel Kant. Now, what does he believe? Okay, according to Hume, he argued Hume by saying that it is possible to find the essence of the self by using our reason. Now, for his idea of the self, Kant believes that man is a free agent. Man is gifted with reason and free will. That's the reason why man can organize the different data gathered by the senses. From this, we can now have a good idea of the self because we can sense, we can understand. That's the reason why we can reason out. Now, Kant's philosophy centers around the inherent dignity of the human being, that man has inherent dignity and should be treated with respect as an end and not as a means. Now, the necessity of his being free is tested in his decision to be moral. At least this is what is according to Immanuel Kant. Because for him, an individual can be or has the free will to be moral or not. But for Kant, he believes that man is a moral being. Thus, for us to know what is our duty as human beings, the duty of the self, we have to rationally, okay, or to carefully reason out on it, okay? Because for him, he believes again that it is possible to find the essence of the self because we are rational beings. Okay? We can sense, that's the reason why we can understand, and that's the reason why we can be rational. In refuting Hume's idea that there is no self, he said that man again is gifted with reason and free will, and he can gather data by the senses. And with this data, we will have an idea of the man, or we can have a good idea of the self. And so we will be proceeding with Sigmund Freud. Of course, Sigmund Freud is not a philosopher, but we will include him here because he has a very good idea of his concept of the self just the same. Now, we know Sigmund Freud as the father of psychoanalysis, and his work centers around the mind and its development. He devised a structure that defines man according to his biological structure and in the influence of his social culture environment. Now, a little bit of a trivia about Sigmund Freud. It was claimed that one of the proofs for the unconscious is what we call slip of the tongue. Okay, siya po yung nag-champion ng idea ng slip of the tongue. It is when instead of saying Sean, we blurted out Paulo, meaning what we are thinking is the person that we said rather than the person that we said it to. Okay? Now, according to Sigmund Freud, the ego is not master of its own house. The ego is not master of its own house. Alam natin yung konsepto ng the ego and the superego, at least from Sigmund Freud. Now, for him, the self or man is a combination of his biological structures and the influence of his social cultural environment. Meaning it's not only our biology which is important, but you bring in your biology, okay, and the influences that you get from your environment, from your social cultural environment, and you bring this together, and that's when you will have a good perception of the self. Now, he devised a tripartite division of man. When you say a tripartite, meaning tatlong bahagi ng tao. So you have the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, when we talk about the id, this represents the biological structure of man. The superego represents the social cultural environment. And when the id and the superego are at battle against each other, and whoever wins between them is manifested in the ego, and the ego being the self. Pero tama yung sinabi ni Sigmund Freud dito, because if that is the case, then the ego is not the master in its own house, because it only manifests whoever wins against the id and the super ego. Now, for us to better understand, we have to make sure that we understand that the super ego represents the ethical component of the personality, and it provides the moral standards by which the ego operates. Okay, now in man's stages of development, the id and the superego will find themselves clashing against each other, with the superego trying to control the impulses of the id, and the id trying to satisfy its urges, because again, the id represents the biological structures. Now, so for example, you saw a chocolate, your id, okay, wants to be satisfied because it's urging you to eat the chocolate. However, your superego, because of the social cultural environment, okay, and the impulses being controlled, okay, by the cultural environment. So dito po maglalaban yung id at yung super ego. Okay, now the winner again of this battle between the id and the super ego will be manifested in the ego, which is again the self. Hence the quote, the ego is not master in its own house. Now, if ego misbehaves, then the id wants. This battle is all taking place in the subconscious. Now, the realm of the ego is found in the conscious. Now, let's proceed with the next one. This is Gilbert Ryle, and at least according to him, minds are things. Minds are things, but different sorts of things from the body. Okay? Different sorts of things from the body. Now, Ryle claims that the problem of philosophy, kaya medyo mahirap unawain yung mga sinasabi sa philosophy, because these were only brought about by our confusion, because of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and others. Now, for him, the goal of philosophy should only be to clear this confusion through linguistic analysis. Now, what does Gilbert Ryle say about the self? Now, for him, the debate on the definition of the self is only a problem of language. Say, a talk of the mind is only a talk of the behavior. The mind is not distinct from the body, but for him, it is part of a certain aspects of our body. Now, for him, the mind is not like a specific separate entity, but is certainly part of our body. Ideally, the separation of mind and soul and body could be possible, but in practice for him is not the case. The only way by which we can know how the mind is working is through the behavior of the person. And we will be able to know that through what? Okay, sa pamamagitan noong ating mga kinikilos. Now, Ryle criticized Descartes and said Descartes made a category mistake. In a discourse, separation of mind, body, and soul is only possible but not in practice. Bakit daw ba natin pinaghihiwa-hiwalay pa? Why do we have a dichotomy or a trichotomy of man when we have to understand that this is only a problem of language? Ginugulo lang natin ang tao. Now, for him, we can see how the mind is working through his behavior, because for him, the self can be known by the behavior. So kung ano ang kinikilos ng tao, yun siya. Okay, in fact, importanteng maintindihan po natin itong part po na ito. Again, as we continue on, here we have another philosophy who has his own concept of the self, and this is Paul Churchland. For him, we do not have an organ for understanding and recognizing moral facts. Okay, we do have an organ for understanding and recognizing moral facts, and we call this the brain. Okay, so yun po yung sinasabi niya rito. Okay, now, ang ideya rito is that when we talk about Paul Churchland, this is already a combination, okay, of biology, of neuroscience, and excuse me po, and philosophy for us to understand the self. Now, Paul Churchland is known for his eliminative materialism, which is the idea that the mind is unreal and the brain is real. So here, he tries to distinguish the concept of the mind and the brain. When we talk about the brain, okay, ang brain ay napag-aaralan, nakikita, kaya nga po pinihiwa at tinitingnan, pinag-aaralan. But when we talk about the mind, do we say that when we see the mind, do we say that the brain and the mind are one and the same? Because, again, we talk about this, posibleng magkaiba siya. That's the reason why, at least according to Paul Churchland, when we talk about the mind is not true. However, the brain is real. For Paul Churchland, the self is the brain, because for him, the brain is the essence of the self. The essence or the brain is the essence of the self. What does that mean? Kapag ang tao ay namatay, nakakakilos pa ba siya? Wala na. Okay? Kaya sinasabi na when you talk about the self, it's all about what? It's all about yung utak ng tao. The term mind, moods, emotions, actions, and consciousness are deeply affected by the state of the brain. Kaya kapag brain dead ng isang tao, do we say na meron pa siyang mood, may emotion pa siya, may action pa siya, may consciousness pa siya? Yun po yung ipinagtatanggol dito ni Paul Churchland. Okay, Paul Churchland, the term mind, mood, emotions, actions are deeply affected by by the state of our brain. So yun po yung ipinaglalaban niya dito. Okay? So, proceed po tayo dito kay Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He is an existentialist. And when we say an existentialist, pag pinag-usapan po na konsepto ng existentialism, okay, he believes that a person is defined by virtue of movement or his expression. For him, a person is the sum of all that he does with his body, including his interpretation of his past and his decisions. Now, for him, the definition of self is all about one's perceptions of one's experiences and the interpretation of those experiences. So, for him, the self is grounded on the experiences from the past, the possibilities of the future for the future, and our present cognition or our present understanding of ourself. Okay? That's the reason why, according to him, okay, we know not through our intellect, but through our experience. Okay? So for him, our experiences are very important. Okay? So ayun po yung idea ng ano po 'yon? Okay? Ng philosophy ni Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Okay? Ayun po yung kanyang sinasabi rito. And for us to be able to summarize all this para po hindi tayo masyadong malito, ito po iyon. According to Socrates, he said that man is essentially a soul. And this was seconded by Plato. Okay? For Augustine, he extended Plato's idea and he said that man is created in the image and the likeness of God. You talk about the Imago Dei, and is essentially a soul whose goal is to be with God. For Rene Descartes, he emphasized the non-physical form of man and said that in essence, man is mind, a thinking being. Okay? A thinking being separate from his body. However, it doesn't mean that we don't need the body because for him, the body is a necessity for mind in order for it to perform an act. For John Locke, okay, ano sinasabi ni John Locke po dito? According to John Locke, okay, the self is a consciousness, and that for as long as we have memories, the memory theory, yung pinag-usapan natin kanina, about who we are and our identity, then that tells us that we are that same person, that same self that we are conscious of now. Now, according to David Hume, he declared that there is no self. There is no permanent self because the self is only a bundle of senses that keeps on changing. However, this was refuted by Immanuel Kant, who said that it's possible for us to construct ourselves because we can think, we can sense, we can organize the data. That's the reason why we can have a rational idea of the self. However, for Sigmund Freud, he asserts that man is made up of two things, the conscious and the unconscious, and that man has many layers. He talks about the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, for Gilbert Ryle, he believes that how one behaves is a big factor in showing who man is, because the self is reflected in his behavior or her behavior. Now, for Paul Churchland, he declared that the brain is the essence of the self. And lastly, for Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he rejected entirely the idea of mind and body dichotomy because for him, man is all about how he sees himself. And it is very subjective. It's all about our experiences that matters, according to Merleau-Ponty. Okay, so para ho maintindihan natin, ito po yung ating summary dito. For Socrates, for Plato, and St. Augustine, the self is an immortal soul that exists over time. They are not empiricists because they believe that there is a life hereafter. For Descartes, the self is a thinking being distinct from the body. For John Locke, okay, our personal identity is made possible by our self-consciousness. Okay, for David Hume, there is no self. For Immanuel Kant, there is a self. Okay, for Sigmund Freud, it's very multi-layered. For Ryle, it's all about our behavior. For Churchland, it's all about the concept of the brain. For Merleau-Ponty, it's very subjective because our experiences differ from each other. Okay? And that wraps up our discussion on the philosophical view of the self. Again, this is Sir E. And again, thank you for joining me today. I'll see you again next time. Again, this is SS31, Understanding the Self. And today we discussed the philosophical view of the self. Again, this is Sir E now, signing off.